The year was 1942, and if you were a German pilot of the Luftwaffe, cruising high above the Reich, there was one American fighter you didn't fear: the new P-51 Mustang. It's a strange thing to think about today, when we look back on the Mustang as arguably the most legendary fighter plane of the war. Most people remember it as the Cadillac of the skies, the fighter that finally gave our bomber boys the long-range escort they needed to survive the missions over mainland Europe. But that's the myth history tends to polish up for us. The reality, gentlemen, is that the first iteration of that beautiful airframe, the P-51A, was actually a disappointment. Therefore, we have to ask ourselves, how did a plane that was first laughed at by our enemies become the machine that ultimately broke the back of the German Air Force? If you served or had family serving in the 8th Air Force, you know the emotional stakes of those early bomber missions. Our B-17s and B-24s were flying blind into a hornet's nest, and they had a travel limit. Their escorts had to turn back long before the bombers reached their targets, places like Schweinfurt or, yes, Berlin. It was a harrowing, lonely trip for the final hour. But the early Mustang wasn't the answer. The problem wasn't the airframe itself. It wasn't the wings, the control surfaces, or the general engineering put together by the North American Aviation factory in California. It was actually a flaw so fundamental, so obvious, that it crippled the entire plane. It was simply under-engineered for high-altitude combat. Now, the engineers had a fantastic shell. The P-51's revolutionary laminar flow wing design was truly advanced. Many aviation experts say it was already 10 years ahead of its time. Therefore, the plane had incredible speed potential at lower altitudes. It was quick and nimble below 15,000 feet. But you don't fight the Luftwaffe at 15,000 feet. You fight at 25,000 feet, where the enemy fighters like to hide, waiting to pounce on our exposed heavy bombers. Many pilots told us that above 15,000 feet, the Allison V-1710 engine, the one originally fitted in the Mustang, would essentially choke. It lost its oomph. It was like a marathon runner suddenly being forced to breathe through a straw. It just didn't have the lungs to compete. Imagine you bought a brand new, top-of-the-line Buick, gleaming with the best American steel, a true beauty on the road. But the moment you hit the highway, the engine starts sputtering and you can't get past 55 miles per hour. That was the P-51A. It had a fatal flaw in its heart that the Germans knew instantly how to exploit. They understood the machine's ceiling, and they only needed to climb higher to look down and quite literally laugh at our supposedly forgotten fighter. Therefore, the Mustang needed not just an upgrade, but a fundamental heart transplant, or it was destined to be a forgotten footnote in the history of aerial warfare. That initial failure, that deep frustration over a beautiful plane that couldn't deliver, is what leads us to the biggest secret of the air war, the subject of the next part of our story. This problem of high-altitude failure created a crisis of confidence. The Mustang was grounded from its true destiny as a long-range bomber escort, and the clock was ticking. Something drastic, something almost miraculous had to happen to fix that sputtering Allison engine and the very poor performance it offered when it mattered most. But the fix didn't come from America. It came from across the pond, an experiment born of desperation and a stroke of genius that married a sleek American airframe to a legendary British engine, transforming the P-51 into the true Berlin Escort. This transformation is what truly matters. When the Mustang first arrived in the theater, many of us in the service, especially those close to the bomber crews, felt a wave of relief. Finally, a single-engine fighter with the range to go the distance. But that relief was short-lived because the airplane's biggest weakness was quickly exposed, turning what should have been a shield into a vulnerability. The problem wasn't a visible dent or a faulty rivet, it was a fundamental compromise in its power plant. The irony of the early P-51 was that it was born from a British necessity, but was crippled by an American engine choice. The British Purchasing Commission, desperate for fighters, asked North American Aviation to build one of their existing planes, but NAA, in a true entrepreneurial spirit, said they could build a better one from scratch. They designed the P-51 airframe, sleek, beautiful, and fast, around the American Allison V-1710 engine. That engine was capable, but it was really designed for low-altitude work, and that was the fatal flaw.
Think about the air war in Europe. Our strategic bombers weren't loitering down in the valleys. They were up where the air thins out, usually between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, to get above most flak and evade some of the enemy fighters. Therefore, the Escorts had to operate in that same thin, freezing air. This is where the Allison engine, the heart of the early P-51, simply gave up. Up high, the engine's single-stage, single-speed supercharger couldn't compress the thin air sufficiently. It was a failure of oxygen delivery. The power output, which was respectable down low, plummeted by nearly 50% at high altitude. It didn't just lose a little speed, it lost the ability to keep up with the fight. When a German Focke-Wulf pilot saw an early model Mustang struggling to climb above 20,000 feet, they knew they had a slow target. This performance drop created a massive tactical gap. An American bomber cruising at 25,000 feet was suddenly being escorted by a fighter that couldn't operate much above it. The German fighters, equipped with superior supercharging technology, could climb to 30,000 feet or more, giving them the crucial altitude advantage. Dive, attack, and disappear back up high. The P-51, even with its phenomenal aerodynamics, couldn't match that vertical escape. Consequently, the aircraft could only dogfight on a level playing field, or risk losing power and becoming an easy target on a climb. It's a bitter pill to swallow when you realize your advanced machine is functionally obsolete above the clouds. But the problem wasn't just performance, it was endurance. The early Mustangs that were deployed had their combat radius limited not by fuel but by engine efficiency at combat altitudes. To compensate for the engine's weakness, pilots often had to keep the throttles pushed harder than they should have just to maintain station with the bombers. This aggressive throttling burned fuel much faster. Therefore, the long-range promise of the P-51 was a lie. It was an escort for about as long as a P-47 or a P-38, often forcing it to turn back at the most dangerous point of the mission, leaving the bombers completely exposed to the waiting enemy. Many missions into Germany had to be scrubbed or suffered catastrophic losses precisely because of this inability to provide sustained, high-altitude cover. Many veterans remember the feeling, watching the escorts turn back, knowing that from that point on, you were on your own. The P-51 was supposed to fix that agonizing moment, but in its initial form, it only delivered a painful illusion. The pilots who flew them were heroic, trying to make the best of a flawed situation, but they were constantly fighting the altimeter, knowing that every 1,000 feet gained was a struggle the German boys didn't have to face. This failure wasn't just about speed. It was about trust and reliability when our young men were betting their lives on the machine beneath them. The plane was only half finished. The final twist of the knife came from our own allies. The British, who had initially championed the airframe, understood the problem immediately, far better than the American engineers who were stuck on the Allison. The British had experienced similar issues with their own aircraft early in the war and had developed a potent solution. Therefore, they didn't just see the P-51 as a failure, they saw it as an opportunity. The flaw was so pronounced that the British, after flying the Mustang in their own tests, recognized that the airframe was an absolute diamond waiting for the right setting. They knew the fix was not to tinker with the Allison engine, which had reached its design limit, but to simply discard it entirely. However, convincing the American High Command of this bold, almost insulting notion that the heart of their new plane was fundamentally wrong was another massive battle. The P-51 was a truly magnificent piece of metal, but it was currently fitted with the wrong-sized shoes for a marathon. What it needed was the raw, reliable power of a legendary engine, a foreign engine with a reputation for high-altitude grit. This required swallowing national pride and accepting that the British solved a problem we had only just created. If you want to understand how our grandfathers won the war, you have to understand this moment of humility and collaboration. This technical gap, this moment of weakness, became the very catalyst for the Mustang's transformation. So the next step in this story is the most critical, the fateful decision to marry the sleek American design with the most powerful piston engine in the world, the engine that the British had been perfecting for years. If this deep dive into the engineering stakes of World War II was resonating with you, please consider giving this video a like. Many viewers tell us it helps surface these forgotten pieces of history for others who value the story of how our boys fought. We're moving from the problem, the fatal flaw of the Allison engine, to the solution, the engine swap that shocked the world and earned the Mustang its wings over Berlin. The fundamental problem with the P-51 was a hard pill for American command to swallow. The Allison 1810 Vine engine was the wrong tool for the job. It was a matter of national pride, but our boys in the sky were paying the price. At 25,000 feet, where the battle raged, the Allison gasped while the German engines soared. Therefore, a bold, almost impossible decision had to be made, one that crossed an ocean and redefined air combat.
The solution didn't come from a new R&D lab in the U.S. It came from a chance encounter and a moment of engineering brilliance in Britain. The British had been dealing with high-altitude performance issues for years and had perfected the answer, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Specifically, the Merlin 60 series, which featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. This piece of kit was the lungs the Mustang desperately needed. It was at the Rolls-Royce factory in Hucknall that the fateful experiment took place. A couple of British engineers, keen on improving the Mustang's performance, decided to take a captured P-51 airframe, the beautiful, advanced shell we had built, and attempt the impossible, installing the powerful Merlin engine. But this wasn't a simple bolt-on. The two engines were vastly different in size, cooling requirements, and weight distribution. The original Allison was longer and thinner, while the Merlin was shorter and bulkier. The primary challenge was integrating the Merlin's immense cooling radiator and air intake system without destroying the Mustang's perfect aerodynamics. However, the team pushed through. They realized that the P-51's famously efficient scoop beneath the fuselage could actually accommodate the complex intercooler and larger radiator required by the Merlin 60 series engine. The results were electrifying. The original P-51A, powered by the Allison engine, topped out at about 2,200 horsepower at its peak altitude. The new Merlin-powered Mustang, later dubbed the P-51B and P-51C, delivered nearly 3,000 horsepower at high altitude due to that massive compression boost from the two-stage supercharger. That wasn't an incremental improvement. That was a revolutionary leap. The plane's top speed jumped by 50 to 80 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, making it one of the fastest planes in the sky, capable of catching or outrunning anything the Luftwaffe had. This change didn't just match the enemy, it gave us a distinct, sustained advantage. This engine swap solved the fatal flaw, but it also unlocked the Mustang's true, long-forgotten destiny, long-range escort. The new Merlin engine, with its superior supercharging, was incredibly efficient when operating at cruising speeds in the high, thin air. Therefore, pilots could now throttle back and sip fuel, where the Allison that previously guzzled it just to stay airborne. The combination of the Merlin's efficiency and the P-51's massive internal fuel tanks and external drop tanks meant the new Mustang could fly all the way to Berlin and back. Suddenly, the bomber crews didn't have to face that dreadful, lonely hour of unprotected flight. The forgotten airframe was now the one machine the Luftwaffe couldn't escape,
even in the deepest recesses of Germany. For those of us who lived through the early war years, this was the moment everything shifted. This wasn't just a win for aviation, it was a win for morale. The feeling among the bomber boys, knowing those sleek silver Guardians could now stay with them all the way, was priceless. The era of the short-range Escort was over, and the war in the air, previously a brutal exchange of attrition, was about to be decided by persistence. But the German High Command was slow to recognize this sudden and dramatic change in the tactical landscape. The integration of the Merlin engine into the Mustang was not a simple production decision. It was a desperate gamble that paid off. The American military had initially shelved the P-51, convinced that its future was limited to low-level reconnaissance. However, the news of the British experiment was too potent to ignore. The fact that the Merlin had unlocked the plane's full potential forced a complete and rapid shift in procurement strategy. Within months, the new Merlin-powered Mustangs were rolling off the assembly lines, quickly replacing other fighters in the long-range Escort groups. Therefore, a plane that had been a grounded afterthought was now being hailed as the savior of the bomber fleet. This technical fix provided the strategic leverage needed to finally win the war of factories over Germany by allowing our bombers to operate with impunity deep behind enemy lines. This entire chapter of history proves one powerful point. Humility can be the greatest engine of innovation. We swallowed our pride, accepted a British-made engine, and the result was victory. Now that we understand the technical marriage of the Merlin and the Mustang, the most pressing question remains: did the P-51 live up to the hype in the brutal skies over Berlin? Did its presence truly break the German resolve, or was it simply a better way to lose? We've covered the engineering and the critical engine swap. We need to know what happened when this newly reborn American plane went head-to-head with the German aces. Subscribe if you value these deep dives into military history, because the next section will reveal the true measure of the Merlin-powered Mustang in combat. We've seen how the British Merlin engine gave the P-51 the powerful new heart it needed. But the true test wasn't on a factory floor or in a test pilot's logbook. It was over the skies of Germany, particularly Berlin, where the flak was thick and the Luftwaffe was fighting for survival. Therefore, the critical question remained: could this miraculously reborn American plane actually change the outcome for our bomber crews? The answer arrived not in headlines, but in the grim, hard-won statistics of the 8th Air Force. Before the Merlin-powered Mustang was fully deployed, bomber losses on deep penetration missions, the ones into the heart of the Reich, were crippling. We were suffering losses as high as 20% on some missions, a rate that was simply unsustainable. It was a death sentence for men and machines. The P-51, once fully integrated as the primary escort, flipped that terrifying equation on its head. Within months, bomber losses on these same deep raids dropped dramatically, settling into a range of 3 to 5%. This wasn't just a numerical drop, it was a psychological victory for every crewman who climbed into a flying fortress. The Mustang's success wasn't just about speed, it was about endurance. Previously, the German pilots knew exactly when their prey would be abandoned. Our short-range P-47s would hit their fuel limit and have to turn back, leaving the bombers alone for the longest, most dangerous part of the journey. But the Merlin's efficiency and the P-51's streamlined design meant the plane could stay with the bombers for the entire round trip. This provided a persistent psychological presence. The German pilots, who once waited patiently for the escorts to depart, now realized the Silver Guardians were staying for dinner. This forced them to engage earlier, farther from their bases, and always under the threat of a full-scale dogfight. So the entire nature of their defense strategy had to change, eroding their tactical advantage. Think about the feeling of a German pilot waiting to ambush a bomber stream only to realize the American fighters were there and they're not leaving. It's like waiting for the cops to go home so you can rob the store, but they just pull up a lawn chair and start drinking coffee. Many veterans recount that the mere presence of the P-51, high, fast, and persistent, was often enough to turn away attacks that would have otherwise decimated the bomber formations. This was long-range protection, finely delivered.
The P-51 didn't just accompany the bombers, it went out and actively hunted the German interceptors. The Merlin engine's performance above 25,000 feet meant the P-51 could now dictate the terms of the engagement. The Bf-109s and FW-190s, the proud workhorses of the Luftwaffe, were suddenly facing a faster, higher-flying opponent. However, the Mustang pilots didn't just rely on speed. Its wide wing and exceptional handling made it a superior dogfighter in many situations. This combination of altitude, speed, and maneuverability led to a staggering kill ratio. By the war's end, the P-51 accounted for nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft shot down, a true testament to the complete package the Merlin engine created. We often talk about the Escort mission, but the Mustang's true value lay in the fighter sweep. The Mustangs would often fly far ahead of the bombers, clearing the skies by aggressively hunting the German fighters before they could even get close to the bomber stream. This was essentially a preemptive strike, pushing the battle further and further back toward the German airfields. It's like having a dedicated security detail that not only walks with you, but actively patrols the entire neighborhood, removing every potential threat before it can get near your home. This aggressive offense was a key strategic shift, turning the defensive war into an offensive one. The P-51 became known by the bomber crews as the Guardian Angel, and this nickname was hard-earned. Consider the human cost. Early in the war, every mission to a distant target meant an unspoken acceptance of massive risk. The psychological toll of that final, unescorted leg of the journey was immense. Therefore, the arrival of the P-51 was a genuine emotional and existential relief. The P-51 didn't just save metal, it saved men. The fighter pilots themselves loved the P-51. Many famous aces like Chuck Yeager and Don Gentile achieved their legendary status flying the Mustang. Because the plane was fast and reliable, it allowed the pilot to focus entirely on the fight, rather than constantly nursing a struggling engine. It enabled talent to shine. The name Berlin Escort isn't a factory designation. It's a badge of honor earned in the thick of combat. Our ability to execute missions over the German capital was a massive propaganda and military victory. One veteran pilot famously said, "When I saw the silver Mustangs, I knew I was going home." That simple sentence captures the true test of the P-51. It didn't just succeed, it altered the calculus of survival and changed the war's momentum. We've established that the P-51 was a success and why it worked. But the experience of flying that machine, the noise, the cold, the sheer, raw feeling of being an air warrior who finally had a machine that could go the distance, is a story best told by the men who were actually strapped into the seat. We need to honor their experience. Share your thoughts in the comments if you ever knew a veteran who flew or was escorted by the P-51. Hearing these personal connections helps us keep the history alive. We've established the engineering miracle and the tactical shift brought by the Merlin-powered Mustang. We know the kill ratios and the bomber survival rates improved dramatically.
But those numbers don't tell the full story. To truly appreciate the P-51, you have to understand what it felt like to be inside that cockpit. The noise, the cold, the sheer, raw feeling of being an air warrior who finally had a machine that could go the distance. The men who flew the plane called it the Cadillac of the skies. That wasn't just some marketing slogan. It was a genuine term of affection and respect, usually reserved for the most comfortable and capable aircraft. The Mustang earned this name because of its exceptional, almost effortless handling. Unlike the rugged, ground-pounding P-47 Thunderbolt, which felt heavy and required constant attention, the Mustang was responsive and light on the stick. Many older pilots who transitioned from the P-40 or the P-47 felt an immediate, profound difference. The P-51, thanks to its laminar flow wing and highly efficient airframe, was a stable gun platform. Therefore, when you needed to line up a shot on a German fighter, the plane responded with grace and precision. The pilot wasn't fighting the aircraft was an extension of the pilot's will. However, the P-51 was a long-legged machine built for endurance, and that meant cold. The high-altitude air was brutally cold, and despite the advancements, the heating systems were notoriously unreliable. Many pilots recount that even while flying in heated suits, they were often freezing, spending 8 hours or more in an aluminum tube that felt more like a freezer than a fighter plane. That was the daily reality of being a Berlin Escort. Imagine sitting in that cramped space for 8 hours, focusing solely on maintaining your formation position, scanning the endless blue for the telltale sign of a German attack. It's a profound experience of isolation. The P-51 gave the pilot time to think, time to worry, and time to appreciate the sheer loneliness of air combat over enemy territory. But that loneliness was better than the alternative, watching your bomber companions, who were often your friends, being shot out of the sky without adequate protection. The P-51 transformed that terrible dread into a powerful sense of purpose. You were the guardian. The true emotional payoff of the P-51 arrived for the bomber crews, the young men flying the B-17s and B-24s. Before the Merlin upgrade, seeing the Escort fighters turn back was the signal of doom, the moment their lives became cheap. Therefore, the arrival of the P-51, with its distinctive silhouette and silver skin, was a genuine promise of survival. The fighter pilots understood this unique relationship. They would often fly tight formation near the bombers, not just for protection, but as a visible show of confidence. They were delivering a psychological boost as much as fire superiority. This bond, this silent pact between the fighter and bomber crews, cemented the P-51's place in history. We often overlook the simple psychology of warfare. The belief in your machine is a weapon itself. The P-51 gave our pilots that confidence. If you value hearing these behind-the-scenes emotional stakes, the human cost and the sudden relief, subscribe to the channel. Your support tells the algorithm that this history matters to you, and it helps us share these stories with others. The P-51 allowed for a completely new, aggressive tactical doctrine. With the range problem solved, generals like Jimmy Doolittle were able to change the rules of engagement. Previously, our fighters had to stick close to the bombers, a purely defensive posture. However, Doolittle realized that the best defense was a good offense. He unleashed the fighters to fly ahead and seek out and destroy the German fighters wherever they could be found. This shift was a game changer. The P-51 pilots were now predators, not just protectors. So they were able to force the German planes into battle at a disadvantage, often far from the bomber stream. This decisive action broke the back of the Luftwaffe's fighter strength, making missions over Berlin less of a death sentence and more of an escort mission. Consider the story of Major Don Gentile, one of the most famous Mustang pilots. He was flying a P-51B, and his aggressive seek-and-destroy style earned him the nickname the Demon. His success wasn't just personal skill, it was the sheer capability of the P-51 that allowed him to take calculated risks and survive. His exploits, and those of other aces, created a mythology around the Mustang that further boosted the morale of every airman in the theater.
Ultimately, for the men who flew them, the P-51 was more than just a piece of metal, it was a lifeline. It represented the final piece of the strategic puzzle that allowed our forces to truly take the war to Hitler's inner circle. But the experience of flying it required immense skill and personal fortitude. The reliability of the Merlin engine meant less time nursing mechanical failures and more time focusing on the horizon for enemy aircraft. It gave them a fighting chance. That sense of a fighting chance, of having a plane that was up to the challenge, is the greatest thing the Mustang meant to the young men who piloted it. It's important that we, the generation now looking back, remember the true cost and the eventual triumph. These were not superheroes, they were ordinary young men facing extraordinary danger. The P-51 gave them a tool equal to that danger. They had earned the right to fly a Cadillac of the skies after enduring the sputtering starts of earlier, flawed machines. We've explored the machine and the men. Now we have one final, crucial question. What were the long-term strategic implications of the P-51? Did it just win the air war, or did it permanently change the way air power was conceived and executed? Stay with us, because the conclusion will reveal why the P-51's legacy wasn't just about victory in 1945, but about changing the rules of aerial engagement forever. We'll also provide a clear way to revisit these stories. We've seen the Mustang born from necessity, transformed by the British Merlin engine, and proven by the grit of our pilots over Berlin. But the true measure of a legendary weapon isn't just winning the last battle, it's about changing the rules for the next war. Therefore, the final question we must ask is, how did this sleek fighter, cast in aluminum, permanently change the strategy and definition of air power? Before the P-51, the prevailing wisdom was that strategic bombing could not be adequately protected over deep distances. The P-51 didn't just challenge this, it shattered it. It created the doctrine of deep penetration fighter escort. This shift meant that Air Force planners were no longer limited by the combat radius of their fighters. They could now send heavy bombers anywhere within range of the P-51, giving them true global reach. The war over Germany before the Mustang was a brutal war of attrition for our bomber crews. We were constantly losing men and machines simply due to the limitations of physics and engine design. But the P-51 flipped the switch from defense to offense. By being able to fly faster, higher, and further than anything the Luftwaffe could produce consistently, the Mustang forced the German fighter pilots into a defensive battle for their own skies. The effect was that our forces, for the first time, were fighting on our terms, and the Luftwaffe's ability to replace its losses was severely hampered. Therefore, the P-51 accelerated the inevitable outcome of the war by allowing the crippling destruction of German industry while simultaneously reducing the rate of loss for our most experienced bomber crews. This proved to future military planners, those strategists looking ahead to Korea and the Cold War, that air superiority must be achieved before deep strikes. The Mustang established the blueprint. You must clear the enemy's airspace and secure your bombing routes. It's like building the interstate highway system. You don't start paving the road until you've cleared all the obstacles and secured the land. The P-51 was the ultimate clearance vehicle. The P-51 also left an enduring legacy of international collaboration. The fact that its success hinged entirely on the marriage of American aerodynamic genius, the airframe, and British mechanical mastery, the Merlin engine, was an unusual story in a war dominated by national manufacturing pride. However, the lesson was clear. Success favors the best solution regardless of its origin. This spirit of sharing critical technology, the V-1650 Merlin being essentially a license-built Rolls-Royce engine, became a cornerstone of the post-war NATO alliance. Many tell us this open exchange of technology remains a vital tradition in military development today. The story of the P-51 is a powerful reminder that every complex problem has a simple, elegant solution, if you are humble enough to find it. If you want more stories that focus on the human and mechanical ingenuity that defined our history, click the bell and stay with us. It's how we keep these vital histories from fading away. Even as the jet age dawned, the P-51 remained a benchmark. Its design was so aerodynamically clean that engineers studied it for decades. But perhaps its greatest technical legacy wasn't its speed, but its range and efficiency. This concept, the ability to project power over vast distances without compromising speed or payload, became the holy grail of jet fighter design well into the 1950s and beyond. The P-51's endurance capabilities are still a quiet, profound lesson in maximizing fuel efficiency through optimal design. Therefore, this plane, conceived in 1940, set the standard for what a long-range fighter must be for the next 50 years. It wasn't just a wartime machine, it was a design principle. The P-51 Mustang is a true icon, representing not just victory, but the moment America realized it could fight and win a total war on two fronts, thousands of miles from home. It went from a German punchline to a symbol of salvation. So the next time you hear that distinct roar of a piston engine at an air show, think about the two engines that defined its life. Which engine do you think best represents the true spirit of the P-51? Thank you for watching this story through to the end. The history of the Mustang is deep and wide, and it's a history we must not forget. We'll be back soon with more stories just like this one. For the full transcript and direct links to related content, check the description below. These stories take time and effort to share, but they are here for you whenever you want them.